Ed, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I see. I have a little block up there.
You should be okay.
Let me measure your attendance.
Everybody.
Mine is perfect.
Oh, gosh.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello.
Hi, how are you? It's Bonnie.
Hi, Bonnie.
It's so nice to see you.
Arlene, I see Carol, I see Kathy. And,
Good evening, my wonderful entities.
this one you need to get rid of. Sorry, I am getting.
Keep going. That's fine.
Ooh, look at that. He's so cute.
Are we sharing?
Don't look at
Not
me.
yet, right? Gallery view. There's gallery view. Shelley.
Hey,
Yay.
Tony.
Martha.
Okay.
I'm not seeing pictures of anyone
Hello?
else.
Who is not? Bonnie?
Yeah, this is Bonnie. I'm not seeing any pictures.
Hello?
Okay, look in gallery
Gwen.
view at the top.
Gallery view at the top. Okay. All righty. Oh, there we go.
Okay. Very
I,
good.
You're
Yeah,
gonna see that. So
I don't feel alone.
There you go.
I just get rid of it because I want to see that stuff.
I know. I'm gonna do that.
Hi, Shelley. How's your new knee?
All right. So you may have to put it here. That's the only thing to move this around.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So and then to share a screen, we go to share a screen.
What do you mean?
Ed, what happened to share screen?
Should be there.
I see it.
Right
I
there.
see it. I see it. I hit
Who?
I hit it. Okay, we have to close it.
Alex.
Ooh, look, it's Arlene.
Who?
She looks really naughty.
It's 7 o'clock.
Weimar Republic. Good
Good.
for you.
What is this?
Wait a minute.
Alex,
All
I
right.
love Metropolis.
Okay.
Okay, you ready?
Are we sharing? Does everyone see our screen?
Caligari and
Everybody sees that screen?
right,
Yes.
the
Yes.
somnambulist from
I
Think?
Dr. Marbuse. It's all there.
Okay.
Okay.
good.
I need to shrink this though.
Okay, come on.
Oh, I'm trying. Sorry. I don't know. Sorry, people. How did?
Worry.
Just leave it there. Who cares?
Well, the thing is, you have to be able to
Well, I have to
see.
be able to see the top, yeah.
Yes.
Alex Shundi, you're coming through. This is Lawrence.
I understand that I could tell by the baritone of your voice.
I'm an alto soprano. What you talking?
You know who else are out? You know who else?
I don't
are
think
alto
so.
sopranos? Yeah.
Pardon.
Okay.
Okay. Got it.
Okay.
All right.
Is that your key?
Okay,
Or,
so
is that
what
your
we're gonna
key?
do?
Okay.
We're gonna.
Do you want to wait a couple minutes for more people to sign on? It's
Not
just
really.
7:01.
Wait 2 more minutes, Alan.
All right. Wait 2 more minutes. All right.
All
I'm
right.
waiting for Gwen Ann because she texted me and said she didn't get it, and I sent it to her again.
Have a good class, everybody.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
I don't share anybody.
Well, I hit everyone.
Sorry.
So they don't see that when
That's
you
fine.
share the screen.
Okay, that's cool.
Okay. Got it?
Yeah.
Just when you're ready to change things, call me.
Okay, very cool. Where are you gonna be?
I'm running away now.
Elizabeth, you have to stay close. Come on.
No.
Okay. What does the blue hand mean?
Ed, there is an eerie There's
Yes.
an eerie resemblance between you and the robot from Metropolis. Do you see that with your earphones?
With my earphones. Uh-oh.
So it's
Yes.
in the top row, the
I
second
see it.
image from the left.
Yes. Oh my
Well,
God.
people,
Well, I feel like a robot today. So.
what very popular American film of about 10 years ago was mostly influenced by German Expressionism? Anybody?
Hugo. Oh, no, not Hugo. Oh,
Well, you know, maybe some instances of Yugo. Yugo was
No,
filmed.
Hugo was on Georges Méliès.
Yugo was filmed because what's his name's daughter there said, "Why don't you make something the kids can watch instead of just gangster
Scorsese.
films?" So he made Yugo. No. Well, I guess we have to wait a little bit.
Wait 1 minute. I'm waiting for, there's somebody else who just said they couldn't get in, so hold on one second. I'll be right back.
Ex Machina is about a robot that takes on her own life.
Right. Anybody ever
Blade
seen
Runner,
that
Blade Runner
fantastic-
with the replicants. I
Right.
just told my students.
Did you see that fantastic show at the Metropolitan Museum about all the automatons last year?
I wish.
Magnificent show.
Cool.
So Edward Scissorhand is the show that was highly influenced by
Birdie.
Expressionism.
Yes. So cool. That's really interesting.
All right. At 7:04, we're going to start. The Cabinet of Dante Caligari, together with a whole bunch of other films, like Nosferatu, Destiny, The Golem, were a whole bunch of films that were created in Germany starting with actually the very beginning of the First World War around 1914, 1915. And they went on into the 1920s, about 1924, 1925. And they represented a version of Cubism to a certain degree. They used the figure as a kind of a prop that always had a kind of a dark side. And that dark side represented the amazing amount of death and destruction and wounded soldiers that the First World War had in the trenches, both, by the way, in Germany and in Austria, and simultaneously, in terms of using the figure in a way that was never done as an absolute prop into a political world, a world of revolution, was Sergei Eisenstein's films, like The 10 Days That Shook the World, The Battleship Potemkin, that was actually filmed in 1906 in Odessa. And it was about the first revolt that eventually led to the Russian Revolution. And, so the sailors were in horrendous shape. They were exaggerated because it was a silent film, so they were exaggeratedly made up. And the eyes were highly expressive in order to be able to tell what the sound couldn't. What's interesting about that film is that Eisenstein used the actual sailors, many of the actual sailors that actually took part in this mutiny of this battleship, where the leaders of the battleship were horrendously, were just terrible leaders, and they oppressed the sailors. And so there was this major revolt. The fundamental difference between a revolt and a revolution is that a revolt is a lost revolution, whereas a revolution is a one revolt. Okay, so the 10 Days That Shook the World, Alexander Nevsky shows people as props, but also as kind of part of the composition that has a thrill involved that is purely abstract. For instance, there are many scenes shot from above. Don't forget, this is all in black and white, where you see thousands of people running down the street, sort of like angry ants, and they fill the streets. They come together and then they run and march out the street. It's not unlike some of what's going on in our cities today, by the way, in the United States, in terms of what happens when the soldiers and the police come to stop them, and then the melee and the confusion and the chaos as these two relatively ordered textures meet, and so on. So these films, particularly German expressionists, I would say, more so to a large degree than Eisenstein, try to meet the exigencies laid down by Cubism, by Dada, and by German expressionism. And a lot of them are considered to be Cubists, like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, where the whole set was sort of defying perspective and defying gravity. And the figures were sort of wandering through this world in a kind of a confused disarray, not so much unlike what the eye does when people first looked at Cubism, particularly the not the regular Cubism like the Demoiselle d'Avignon that we saw where the figures were just sort of abstracted, but analytical Cubism, synthetic analytical Cubism. And so what is the synthesis of this? I mean, why is it synthetic? It's synthetic because it takes the concept of abstraction and the concept of reality and puts it together in a synthesis. It takes the static two-dimensional surface and puts it together with the time and space experience that we have as we negotiate around our conscious world and pick somebody up. If I'm looking at you as you're talking, as you're looking at me right now as I'm talking, if you were here next to me, you would have the choice of standing up to see what I look like from behind, to walk away and see me get smaller, to come very close and seeing details. None of that was ever apparent in painting pre-modernism. So Cubism was a way to allow for a two-dimensional, static, timeless, lightless in a painting, not in film, lightless world to be analyzed in the same way that one would actually do it in time and space three-dimensionally. So when you join the two things together, you have to find a language with which to express the experience that we have in time and space, in two-dimensional reality, and translate that onto something that is standing still forever and is flat. So there's no three-dimensionality to it. In order to do that, what do? It's like you now take a cube, and for us to see all 6 sides of a cube, we would just pick up the cube and turn it and see all the 6 sides, but you can't do that in the painting. So the only possible way to see all the sides of a cube will be to open it up, like the way you open up a box, and you see 6 squares and rectangles. But so the normal dimensionality of the cube, as a photograph would take, let's say, the photograph is two-dimensional, wouldn't tell us what the cube looks like from behind. So Cubism was a way to be able to take fast shots to a certain degree of what our eyes see two-dimensionally, putting it together. How do you do that to a figure? How do you do that to motion? So we looked last week at things like New Descendant Staircase by Marcel Duchamp. And there you saw how Marcel Duchamp broke up the areas of the figure, not unlike that first Cubist painting, Demoiselle d'Avignon, that we looked at of Picasso, and joined them together in a fragmented way, and that fragmentation implied motion. What's interesting, the last thing we saw was Boccioni's three-dimensional running figure, the aerodynamic running figure. And in there, what he did is that he took the concept of two-dimensional cubism and translated it back to three-dimensionality by using the fragmentation necessary in the flatness of cubism. So it was a very interesting sort of, you go somewhere and then somewhere else, and then you sort of go back to it in a new way. So in order for us to be able to do that, in order for us to be able to get that synthesis and work it out, especially in something that is as fragile and as familiar as a figure, because we are figures, as we talked about the first class. So we're highly critical about all of us, about exactly how we feel, how we are. If I touch my face, it goes way beyond understanding that this is a zygomatic bone that I can feel, because I can feel it from within. And I start thinking about a million things that deal with myself. So, we are experts in the figure. So in order for a cubist painter to be able to take images and fragment them enough to keep the concept of figure, the way that we looked at Malevich, the knife sharpener, right? Where you can see the mustache going like this and the hand moving quickly as that guy was sharpening a knife on the wheel that he was kicking, and you can see the leg going back and forth. Now, in order for you to make that fragmentation somehow come together and give the information necessary as to what it is, right? We have to really, really understand the figure itself. We have to really analyze it in every little micro concept of it, micro filament that makes it, that puts it together. We have to explore it. And that exploration gives us a huge menu from which we take only the ingredients necessary in order for us to simplify the image and put it together in a new way. So you have to really, really analyze something in the same way that Cézanne analyzed the landscape before he translated it into a few little kind of constructive flat brushstrokes that talked about form two-dimensionally. So therefore, it becomes synthetic analytical cubism. In order to create the last part of the synthesis, which is the thesis and the antithesis, thesis or the antithesis, you join them together into a synthesis and create something new. And now, in order to do that, you have to first analyze the thing. So, synthetical analytical cubism. The interesting thing about that is that I've read a lot of art history books. Not one has ever explained this, okay? But artists can explain it for some reason. So, all right, these films, began to sort of understand that concept and translate it to something that does have time and does have movement as opposed to painting, and also does have light because the light emanates from the screen. And as opposed to a painting where if you shut the lights off, it's dead, right? Now, film was a new medium. It was an art medium. It was a fantastic medium. It started to be kicked around in the 1880s. You talked about, that film before, Hugo, and there's Miles, who was the first filmmaker theoretically who actually did hand-colored each little frame, hand-colored, so that when you shoot it together, the color kind of goes like this because each one is a little bit different than the next as it runs, so it looks more vivacious in that sense. He's a guy that took Jules Verne and sort of animated Jules Verne's paintings into vision, or rather Jules Verne's novels, science fiction novels into vision. And so there he did, trip to the moon, trip to the center of the earth, and so on. Miles, French filmmaker. Now, by 1918, when Lenin took over Russia, you have to understand that film was a phenomenon. I mean, people were going crazy over going to the movies and seeing stuff. And German Expressionism was part of that craze of going to a film and seeing conditions and symbolism of this dark world that those people found themselves in as a consequence of this constant wars, especially after having got their ass kicked in the First World War, the Germans, the Austrians, the Hungarians, and the Turks against the Allies. So that in itself caused a period between the First and Second World War, between 1918 and 1939, when the war first started in Europe, of complete and total disaster, which eventually led to Nazism. And now next we're going to see what a lot of the artists, what kind of figures the artists came up with to symbolize that crazy period. Lenin in 1918, as I started to say before, excuse me, as usually I get off on the tributaries and lose sense of the river. So Lenin insisted that every single town in Russia with more than 1,000 people had to have a movie theater. So there were thousands and thousands of movie theaters, okay? And you can imagine the logistics of it. You know, Russia is a big country. If you start off with Russia in California, you go through the whole United States, the entire Atlantic and half of Europe. That's how big Russia is. So you had to have people running around. There were some trains, not very many. You had to have people run around and bring films to all these different little towns and then pick them up and bring other ones. So the logistics of it was mind-blowing, but it was worth it. And Eisenstein was one of the people whose sort of propaganda film helped the government, and the government therefore accepted it and embraced it. Okay. Any questions about that, by the way? Now, you know, if you look at an image like this, you can see what I'm talking about, where you exaggerate the eyes, you make the composition only pertain to the feeling, almost like an aura of hassle that's surrounding this guy. Lipstick, exaggerated chiaroscuro, very stoic, very stark, and then you compare it to this, and you see that you see the relationship between the two, you know, with Edgar Scissorhands. Okay. So, you know, in many, many, many films today, I mean, there was a film about Elliot Ness and the Untouchables that was done towards the end of the 90s, where one scene was an exact duplica of a baby's carriage coming down the stairs that Eisenstein had in one of his films. So the legacy that these first pioneers of film established still follows us, including American films, you know, not just European films. Rosebud. Okay. So what was happening in Germany? So this is George Gross. Now, George Gross was a German painter who was anti-war. He was very liberal. He was very much against what he perceived to be the beginning of dictatorship. And, you know, when he was painting in the 1920s, Germany had the beginning of the street thugs that were the SA, the ones, the brown shirts, as opposed to the SS, the black shirts that followed later on. And those were copying what Mussolini was doing in Italy, because Mussolini did his march on Rome in 1921. And so Italy became fascist fundamentally in 1921, whereas Germany became Nazi in 1931, 10 years later. So this guy did something that today will be very hard to digest by Americans, which is he went against the concept of war, and he derided and he exaggerated and he warped his concept of what warmongers were and capitalists were. So he was against, you know, big, fat, rich industrialists who profit from war, the masters of war, as in Bob Dylan's song, okay? The church, who supported them while walking around with, you know, a ring that cost $2.5 million, you know, and eat like pigs, and the military. So images were warped, but were incredibly powerful. Oh, what's going on here? Sorry about that. Okay, here it is. Now, if you look at this as an example, let me see if I can blow this up a little bit. No, can't do it, sorry. Okay. You can see, you know, this military with his black cross, right? You can see, by the way, this 69 thing, '69 was what all over Europe they used to put that number on military trains that would carry troops from one point to another. There's a group of paintings done by Gino Saverini, who was a futurist, and by Boccioni, who was a futurist, with trains, and you can see the number 69 on the trains, and they're this color, you know, the sort of grigio verde, green gray. So here you have prostitutes, you have capitalists. He was incredible in terms of making the figures caricatures that bespeak of the sort of disgusting war situation that goes on. So here you have someone who's getting the hell beaten out of him by the Nazis. Okay. By the way, Nazi is a word. It's a short for nationalism. Anyway, so he was greatly condemned, obviously, for doing paintings like this and drawings like this. They were against everything that was powerful in Germany. So this guy, you know, who was just a little person to a certain degree, there he is. That's what he looked like. And he came to the United States. And after he came to the United States in the 1930s, he started teaching the Artkunstleague in New York, but he lost his fire. He lost his fire. You know, he felt the fire while he was in Germany, and he was confronted with scenes like this. By the way, his composition is amazing. His reduction, you know, what he does, the caricatures that he comes up with are critical as much as possible about this sort of piggish, fat, rich warmongers and profiteers and their lackeys who are the soldiers. Can you imagine today a painter in the United States, you know, showing American soldiers in that light? So it was a very dangerous thing to do then, as it would be today in our world. This is a collage. It's a modern collage, but it's done a la George Grosz, including putting a chamber pot on somebody's head like a helmet. Here's a veteran, you know, a very Germanic, sort of stiff and obviously wounded in war, and a bureaucrat with a lot of money, with no soul, a profiteer back here, and a faceless worker. And behind is the factory. And who is benefiting from it? The person in the foreground, who is the richest. And so this is, here he's using the figures in order to show the worst possible side of the human condition as a political criticism of a system that caused a tremendous amount of death and destruction all over Germany. Okay, so here's another one, the sort of automaton and this prostitute. George Grosz. You know, anytime that we talk about people like this, if you write down the person's name, Grosz, on your own, you can go to places, you know, to things like this and find out more about it because they're worth it. We can't, we don't have the time to be able to go into depth on each one of these people. I don't know what the hell that is. Hold on 1 second, please. Uh-oh. Yeah, there's a problem here, Elizabeth. It says I got Grosz, and then these guys. It's okay. It's okay. Okay, it's okay. We'll just skip. Talk enough about them. All right. So now over here, what we have is Max Beckmann. Max Beckmann is another one who was a member of the German army during the First World War. He actually fought in the Alps against the Italians along the Pieve region of the foot of the Alps facing Austria, Piave. And this is one of his paintings. Now, something like this is an amazingly strong and difficult to watch situation. In order for you to understand why he did this to these figures, because they are all to a certain degree tortured, violated, imprisoned, and crucified by what's going on, okay? Including a comment on communism itself. And we're not quite sure as to whether it was the savior or the real, or someone who was into it too, which is this exaggerated portrait on the right that everybody maintains is Lenin. Okay. This is called The Night, as you can see. Now, what was going on in Germany is that people came back from the war tremendously crippled, tremendously defeated, both morally, psychologically, and physically. Germany got to be inflationary to a degree where by 1924, a basket the size of a laundry basket filled with German marks, the basket was worth more than all the money in it. That's how bad things were. As a consequence, you had streets with a huge amount of beggars. A lot of people that were hurt and crippled during the war, you know, people with one leg, with one arm, with no eyes, begging for food that wasn't there. A tremendous amount of women and men became prostitutes. And amongst this world, you had a fat clergy and a distant, exaggeratedly rich, profiteered capitalist CEOs, okay? And so what you're seeing here, the composition, the line, the position of the figure, the simplification of the figures, the caricature of the figures are all part of this crazy, to a certain degree, very, very, very powerful rendition of the worst of the human condition. So a painting like this, you know, it's kind of a German Guernica. Okay. Let me just go back to this a little bit, which is what we started with. Max Beckmann did a lot of paintings that had a lot of connotations that were sort of anti-clerical. So in a painting like this, what he did is that he did a triptych, a blind man buff it's called, right? That was similar to the early Renaissance altars, where you have a central panel with two small panels on the side that can actually close. And usually as it closed, they would have guardian angels on the doors. Then you would open, and on both sides, you would have the accompanying story of the central image, okay, or accompanying actors of the central, of what was going on in the central image. And here, he did a painting like this using symbols that in this case were about joy, but it's a joy that is confused. It's a joy that is warped. It's a kind of a deviant joy going on. The blind leading the blind, people whispering. I mean, it is, again, an incredibly true comment on a very, very, very bad condition. Don't forget that this stuff was going on in Germany while people like Matisse and Picasso and Leger that we looked at last week were painting these bucolic figures, you know, in Paris. This is Otto Dix, and Otto Dix was yet another ex-soldier who fought in the war, as you can see by a painting like this, okay, and who spent time making these sort of comments on the horrid situation that was going on in Germany at the time. I mean, you can't get more depressing than this guy, Otto Dix. And these figures, like the one that we just saw, you know, this is Sylvia von Harden, who was actually a writer and a friend of his. But monocle, the situation itself, the choice of color, there is a kind of a felt degeneracy. And in doing that, he also chose to look at things that were cubist. Now, this is almost like a version of some of the composition that we saw in those black and white images of the films that we just looked at before. Okay. And then we have Kokoschka. Now, Kokoschka was an Austrian. Let me do something here for a second. He was born in 1886, Kokoschka, and he died in 1980. He was an incredible painter because he allowed the figure to have a very, like a strong sense of fauvism, but in a new way of looking at it. It's realistic enough to be a real portrait, yet the colors are very felt, and the drawing is nowhere near as accomplished as drawing used to be pre-mid-20th century, because it is rendered just enough to show the power of the artist as he's realizing something, or her, or realizing something, excuse me, and doesn't want to go back and perfect it in the same way that the application of color is sort of en passant, okay? He did some amazing landscapes, and he influenced people like Soutine. Oh, I can't see it. Excuse me for a second. Okay. These paintings are fantastic. You know, you have these amazing figures that are, you know, there's another painter, which we're going to look at the last class, Freud, Lucian Freud. And Lucian Freud's portraits that he did in his room, in his studio, where the ground is filled with rags. There's rags absolutely everywhere. Old, funky covers are from the sensitivity of these Kokoschka paintings. Another thing that is really interesting about this guy is the expressiveness with which he sort of Gauguined the background, okay? Again, the drawing is very rough, it's very felt, it's angular, it's a little bit hostile, but it's got a fantastic amount of emotion. Kokoschka. If you look at this painting, you're going to see that there is almost like a total abstraction, even though we can see the foot and the leg and the other leg and the rear end and the shoulder and the two faces. Fundamentally, you get rid of the two faces and you have this very, very, very abstract, expressive way, this sort of confused, almost disturbed fragmentation and use of paint. And then all of that becomes clear once you find the faces, and and those faces are the key as to how to interpret the implied figures in the midst of this crazy abstraction on the bottom right. Somebody who did something very similar to that, another Austrian, but using pure, elegant, clear, hard-edged design, okay, was Klimt, Gustav Klimt. And Gustav Klimt, that's him on the right-hand side. He didn't live very long. Actually, I'll tell you in a sec. He was born in 1862 and he died in 1918. He hung around with this incredible artist that we're going to see next, a young man who also left our world very soon, too soon, Egon Schiele. Klimt was the son of a gilder, and so ever since he was a kid, he picked up the concept of gilding. Hold on one second, please. That's him as a young man. This is a drawing that was done by his friend Egon Schiele, who did this very strange game with the hands, this sort of skeletrical theater-like hands. And this is a Klimt. Now, this Klimt, well, hold on, can I get rid of this thing? Hey, Ed? No, it's okay, I got it. Okay, so here's Klimt. Now, what are we seeing here? Because this is a very, very, very abstract world to a large degree. All on the bottom here, you have designs that are fundamentally Japanese designs. This guy was considered to be the god of Art Deco. Okay, Art Deco was a geometrical version of Art Nouveau, or Liberty, as the Brits would call it. So in here, you can see where he used the gild. And you can see, like in the Kokoschka, that you have this very abstract situation inside of which we see faces and then bodies, and we start to sort of put the whole thing together. Look at this ape on the left-hand side. So being a gilder, again, he did all of those little gold things, the gold on the outside. Gold, by the way, is a color that's chosen by the Vatican, white and gold, white for purity, gold for sanctity. But gold is a mineral that is accepted by every single society in the world. It can be in Asia, it can be in Africa, it can be in Mesoamerica, it can be in Europe, as being something extremely precious, not only because you can beat the hell out of it until it becomes as thin as thinner than a page of a napkin. But and it doesn't tarnish, and it's rare to find, and it glitters and all that. But it's also because it looks like the sun, and you know the sun was all of society's god pre-civilization. The sun was the first major god, the biggest mysterious thing that gave life, and so people always considered finding gold, basically finding fossilized sun rays. So it became very, very important. So, very Austrian, by the way. These people all existed, and a lot of them were commissions that were given to him by nobles. He was also, this guy, a real lech. So he would always find sort of the richest women to go into his studio, and then he would lock the door. And so it was a personally a very heavy trip, as was his friend Egon Schiele. But the sense of design is very modernist, very abstract. Like I said, a tremendous amount of Japanese, where the Japanese use flat decoration as opposed to having the decoration go around the corner and implying that there's volume there. He put down flat panels, almost like a collage of it, but the figures themselves look dimensional. So you have this very strange connection between dimensionality and three-dimensionality and two-dimensionality. This is more like the Kokoschka than anything else. You can see the two heads up above. Without these two heads, we would have no idea as to what we're looking at the bottom. Okay. Magnificent, 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 magnificent. Look at this dress with all the eyes. That's quintessentially typical of an Austrian dress that had the kind of symbolism, because the Austrians are heavy into symbolism. The Austrians and the French and the Belgians, and a lot of gold. And again, very realistic, very stylized. It's called, actually, the way that he painted those paintings is called Austrian mannerism, like the mannerism of Parmigianino, but an Austrian version of it. You can see by the, you know, by the sort of play of hands. But everything else, pure decoration and very, very elegant. You have to go through this and get the, you know, the feeling that the abstraction is telling you until you find the figures. And he has these eyes, you know, he loves eyes. So here you have eyes on the left, on the top left and on the bottom left, like the eyes that we just saw in that dress. And there's little symbols of little personal things, like this guy loved birds and he loved cats, and he always walked around with a cat, Siamese cat actually, wrapped around his shoulders. This is one of his paintings when he was much younger. And you can see that this guy really knew how to paint. You know, this is a very, very powerful, interesting painting, wonderful rendition of making one eye clear and the other one very dark, but both as expressive, very plastic, the face, wonderful background, a lot of feeling. It looks like this guy is about to move any second. The handling of the paint is perfect. It's very, very good. And this is one of his landscapes. And he did a lot of very flat landscape, but this is a very early one. And this was done in situ, in place. And here you can see how theatrical this stuff is. You know, a concert of, you know, sort of like a cappella with a piano player, and, you know, with this sort of theatrical, almost filtered red light coming in from the left-hand side, and a very strange choice of making the whole stuff on the right empty. Typical Klimt. So what we're going to look at next is this. This is one thing that he made that made him the quintessential figure painter of Vienna at the time. So this is what he did. This is a theater that was knocked down. It was destroyed to make room for a much larger, much more modern theater. And this theater was very, very dear to a lot of the sort of established intelligentsia of Vienna. So what he did is that he asked the theater people if he could go, not while there were any plays going on, if he could go on a stage and paint the theater. They let him do that. So picture yourself on a stage painting this theater without the people, okay? He then, because by this time everybody knew who he was in Vienna, he then advertised, actually made posters and wrote letters to the intelligentsia, to the rich people, or to the nobles of Vienna, to everybody, saying, if you like to be included in my painting of this theater as the last play of all of the who's who of Vienna, I will charge you so much money to put you on, you know, near us on the bottom, or if you have less money on the first floor, if you have less money, very little money, you can be some of the people on the top floor. So his studio was crawling with people who would come in, and he would actually paint them. He would actually paint these people. So this is a testament of who was who in Vienna in terms of what they actually looked like. Okay, nobody had ever done that before. He made a huge amount of money doing that. And also, these are some of his murals. If anybody ever wants to go to Vienna and see a fantastic museum, go to see the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, which means Kunst means art, Historische art history museum. It is magnificent. Inside this museum, you're going to find some major masterpieces that you're familiar with, particularly two mind-blowing Correggio paintings. And he was hired to do walls, paint the walls of this museum. Okay, so paintings like this were done as decorations of panels of this museum. He made a tremendous amount of money at it. Here you can see one of the arches, and you can see his paint. So this is a real arch, right? And so is this, with like a real, there's like a little palette here that's all sculpted, and this is a real architectural arch with a little mosaic, pietra dura. But the flatness is magnificent. This is all Klimt, and I mean, these people are a combination between, mid 20th, beginning of the 20th century Austria, Japanese, Art Deco, and then Byzantine painting, because he's putting the strange halos around things. So these are details of the murals that he made for the Kunsthistorische Museum. Very interesting, very, very, very beautiful objects. By the way, this is a version. This is the ape. We saw this painting before. It just keeps going on the left-hand side with a painting of the three graces. See if we can blow this up. We can't. All right. Now, this is Egon Schiele. Egon Schiele was a young man who was, like I said, a very, very, very good friend of Klimt, and Klimt to a large degree was his master. Okay, he learned from him. Schiele was married. His wife died shortly after he died. He died very young, in his early 30s. He had been arrested for having a 14-year-old model, and he was known as an incredible craftsman in drawing. And his drawings were disturbing, to say the least, but magnificently modern. So here you see a face. What makes it modern? First of all, take a look at the way that he painted the cloth, his jacket and his shirt. What he did is that he used a huge amount of turpentine and just some Payne's gray. So he didn't paint all those little lines. What he did is that he painted everything white to begin with, drew the outside, drew the outline of this, and then with a very stiff brush and very liquid paint, put in brush strokes, and you can see the scratches of the brush that the very thin paint doesn't really cover, so that the scratches of the brush themselves gives a wonderful texture to the body, but it's flat. Even though he has lapels, he has sleeves, he has folds, he has shoulder pads. So we know exactly what we're looking at, but at the same token, we're looking at something flat. He did this in 1912, this painting. 1912 is very early, okay? Picasso had just finished doing, Demoiselle d'Avignon 5 years before that. So another thing is that there's no chiaroscuro, meaning dark and light in the face. So the face is relatively flat, okay? But what he does, how he animates it, and that's exactly what happens, is that he touches areas of the face with color. And he does it with such strategy as to how much of it and where to put it, that it looks like somebody beat him up, or he has eczema. He's lived, he has suffered. Someone today is Jenny Saville, that we're going to look at her in the last class. She's a British painter who does magnificent paintings, a lot of very large nude women. But she touches areas of the body in the same way that he does. This is a self-portrait when he was a kid. Here he played the same game using sienna, yellow, sienna with a little bit of orange and Naples yellow mixed together, but very thin, and he builds up his body. Check out to see how strange these hands are. They're very posed, they're very theatrical, and but it's a stupendous drawing. And here you can see the influence of Klimt. This is his room. you know, and guaranteed he saw the painting of Van Gogh's last room because it's pretty much the same thing. Chair in the foreground, bed on the right-hand side, table next to the thing, and a little shelf on the left. So, but it's, again, you know, it's flat. There is no chiaroscuro. The ground is absolutely flat. It's just stained here and there. So is the cushion of the chair. You know, the bed is out of whack in terms of perspective, but somehow it's alive, it moves, it makes sense, and it has this sort of disturbing, almost viscid atmosphere. That's him, and he's gesturing with his hands, the way that he did in his drawings. Now, again, his room. So you can see how wonderful this drawing, how simple this drawing of the door is. This is his jail, by the way, and this is what, you know. He put an orange in there, but that's his bed. It's fantastic. It's a very, very active, beautiful drawing. No figure, but he might as well have it. This is another self-portrait. Again, super thin paint, gestural hands, skeletrical face, no chiaroscuro, but a very, very beautiful, beautiful, controlled and disturbing line. This is his wife. Wonderful, wonderful painting. I'll tell you something really quick about him. He was extremely poor, and he used to go to trade to buy food. He would make a painting and then try to trade the painting for like a fish or for a bag of apples. And there was a fishmonger that lived downstairs from him. And he would go down and bring him a drawing, and this guy would take brown paper, funky brown paper, and wrap a fish in it and give it to him. He would go home, open up the paper, and the paper would have grease marks on it from the fish. He would eat the fish and then take white chalk and go around the outline of this greasy part. And then with more color chalks, he would make a drawing inside of it so that the grease would mix with the chalk and keep it steady. And the whole thing will be surrounded by this very crazy white line. Fantastic drawings. If you go to the Neuye Art Museum on Fifth Avenue, a couple of blocks uptown from across the street to the entrance of the Metropolitan Museum. And it's a fantastic 2 or 3 floor museum that has a dynamite restaurant, by the way. Very good food in there. And in there, you're going to find this whole trip with the Austrian figurative painters, including what we talked about: Klimt, Otto Dix, Max Beckmann, George Grosz, this guy, Egon Schiele, etc. What's interesting about, one of the many things that are interesting about Schiele also, his wife died. His wife jumped out a window after he died. And he died of the fever. Like I told you, he had been in jail. He went up to, one day, Klimt came to visit him. And Klimt said, "I would like to trade you one of my paintings for one of your drawings." And Egon Schiele said, "Are you kidding me? You're my master. You know, your paintings are magnificent. You want one of my drawings?" And Klimt said, "Yes, because your drawings are better than my paintings." Now, Klimt, who was incredibly arrogant and full of himself, to come up with a statement like that was very heavy. And Klimt died a few months before Egon Schiele. Okay, next on the agenda, ladies and gentlemen, we're jumping over from the Atlantic and going to Mexico. And we're going to look at Frida Kahlo. And we're going to later on, next week, we're going to jump into the Mexican Revolution and the kind of figurative painters that came out of Mexico, particularly Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros. But I'm going to start with her because she is a kind of a phenomenon. She wasn't a very good painter, but she was a very good painter. You know, I could certainly say both. She was, out of all the painters that we know of in any art history books that you might pick up and go through page after page after page, she is the most wrapped into herself than anybody else has ever been. fundamentally, 99% of her paintings were about herself. They were self-portraits. She grew up in a bourgeois family. Her mother was Indios. She was a Mexican Native American. Her father was German, okay? He was not Jewish, although all her life she kept telling people that her father was Jewish because she wanted to be, because a lot of people were very anti-Semitic, and she wanted to be part of the people that were not recognized as being, they were minorized. So that's her when she was young. Her as a teenager. Her and her husband twice over, because they got divorced and then came back, Diego Rivera, who looked like an immense frog. And quickly, before we look at her work, when she was 18 years old, she was in a bus next to this guy that was sitting there who had a little bag of gold that he had just discovered, that he had just found, and he was trying to cash it in. The bus hit a wall. One of the hand railings of the bus went into her. It went into her bottom, into her vagina, through her body, and came out of her neck. And she survived. After over 100 operations and years, actually all their life of major suffering, they said that she couldn't live, she lived. They said she could never walk again, she walked again. They said she could never run, she ran. She couldn't get pregnant, which was terrible for her. She smoked like a Turk, as they say in Mexico, fumaba como un turco, and she painted. She looked at Diego Rivera's work, really liked it, showed him her stuff. He liked it. They got together. They had this amazing affair. He was older than her. He was three times her size. She was a Marxist-Leninist who loved Stalin. She was extremely politically naive. She sheltered Trotsky when Trotsky was purged out of the Soviet Union and took political assignment in Mexico. As a matter of fact, when Beria, who was the leader of the communist, system under Stalin, he was the head of the Secret Service, hired somebody to kill him. They killed him right next door to Frida Kahlo's house. At first, he was with her, and then with his wife, had an affair with her. She had many affairs. Everybody had all these incredible affairs, constant. Every person I mentioned, including members of the Soviet Politburo. Okay, certainly Rivera did certainly see that, and so he moved next door, and there they killed him. All right, let me. For a moment, this is her house, okay? So this is Rivera's house, this is her house, and they had a bridge joining the two. These are cactuses, by the way. They look like a fence. Okay, I'm going to go to this. So here she is. And her paintings are about herself. So here she is, dressed in a Catholic charisma, what do you call it in English? First communion dress or a wedding dress, very Western to a certain degree, Spanish Western. And here she is in her Indio, more traditional, folkloristic Mexico, holding hands with herself, her heart connected by a string. Hold on 1 second, please. Okay. let me get this painting. Now, this is typical of Frida Kahlo. What's going on here? She's painting herself with a strap on both shoulders, holding on to her bustle that was made out of plaster to keep her back, intact, in essence, because she had been violated in a way that was mind-blowing. The column in the center is symbolic of her spinal cord, kind of a classical Greek cracked column, and her suffering. She has nails stuck all over her in this desert sea of Mexico, and she's crying. So actually this is a whole version of it where you can see the bustle, etc. Okay, this, in here, she was in her garden. She had this magnificent blue garden. And in this garden, she had little animals. She had baby deer with the little spots on them. She had monkeys. She had dogs. She had cats. She had parrots. And so she always identified with monkeys. She identified with all of her animals. And in many of her paintings, she would use those animals as she would use Mexican folklorism, as you can see her as a child with a mask. And of course, as during the Day of the Dead, where there's a mask of the dead. Paintings like this. Next week, when we start, this is a painting, by the way, of her sister. And her sister had an affair with her husband, which was one of the main reasons why they got the first divorce. It's a very tender and wonderful painting. It is extremely Mexican in the sense that she learned a lot from Diego Rivera. We're going to see his work next week. So, we went this time from German Expressionism to through German Expressionism all the way over to Mexico via Austria. So you have those three: German Expressionism, Austrian Expressionism, Mexican Expressionism, and now we're going to see what other means they use figures in the 20th century next week by looking at the three Mexicans and 4 Americans and a couple of Europeans. I'm going to close by showing one painting that we are going to see again, with which we're going to start next week, just before we talk about Diego Rivera. And this is Balthus, whose real name was Balthazar Klosowski de Rola. He was half French and half Polish. And he is now greatly maligned for being accused of pedophilia, for doing paintings that had dubious intents of very young girls. However, he was a magnificent painter. So where do we stand? Do we accept a magnificent painter because he was a magnificent painter, or do we condemn him for implied over-sexuality? So we're going to start with that. He has a very specific way of working with his figures. Some of them are more abstract like this. Some of them are very symbolic and almost playful like this. Very dynamic. He looked a lot at Piero della Francesca, and he looked a lot at Giotto. One of his masterpieces are this painting that we're going to analyze next week, and we're going to talk about the composition that the figures have acquired in the 20th century that never existed before. Okay, that's it. Any questions?
Yes, please. Diane, you mentioned a museum on or off Fifth Avenue of Austrian figurative painters. What was that museum name? Did you say?
Neue. N-E-U-E, I think, Neue. It's if you walk out of the Metropolitan Museum, what is it, 87th Street, 88th Street?
It's on 86th and 5th.
86th and 5th, the Metropolitan.
The Nori Gallery is on
The
86th.
Noya Gallery, I'm sorry, yes, the Noya Gallery. It's right across the street from the map, basically. Okay.
Okay.
So it's right the corner. You have to go on 86th Street, just as you leave Fifth Avenue, and it's on the right-hand side. You go upstairs, and it's worth the trip. It's wonderful. Fantastic museum. It's a little bit disturbing. You'll see why when you get there.
Oh.
Some of the paintings, I mean, some of the drawings I showed you of Egon Schiele are like vanilla in comparison to what you're going to find there. So, anything else?
No, great.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.
Thank
And
you.
for those of you who are going to be in day after tomorrow class on abstraction, I'll see you then. Arrivederci.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture.
Kamala Harris.
Yeah. Laura.
The question is a Kamala a female camel? All right. Goodbye.
We don't care as long as they win.
That's right, exactly.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Bye.